how big the seam might be. Sleeves will usually always come in this kind of thickness, and for a good sized boat, I'm going to say 30 feet or so, that's probably what you'd use, one strand of this. But for the boats that we have, which are usually smaller, we don't use a full strand. This is called a strand. So we actually split it. And strands will split very easily if you start in the half. It'll just split in half. And this is plenty on a boat like a Susan skiff. So that's what we end up using with that.
Do you buy that as specifically a boat caulking material, or is it just cotton?
No, you buy this, yeah, as a sleeve. And you can get it at most marine stores or something. They'll sell it as that.
And is it like 100% cotton? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I don't think there's anything mixed in with any of this. You can also get, something like this. Some people call this wicking, I suppose, but this is also cotton that's been spun or wrapped a little bit. And some people will use this on some, smaller seams or tighter seams too. And you can get that in different thicknesses also. And that'll work fine. I think that's what they were going to use on the boat downstairs, right? That they were going to do a couple strands of this wicking instead of actually putting, cotton in the seam itself. As far as the tools used for caulking, you see there's quite a variety. This is basic caulking iron, and that's kind of the shape and what they look like. You can get them in different thicknesses. I think it's what they say is aught, which is 0, 00, or 000, and that's usually how thin the end of it is, or the edge of it is. You want it reasonably thin, but not sharp. If it's sharp, you'll actually cut the cotton, which you don't want to do. You want to bunch the cotton up into the seam itself and set it well. And they almost all have a little bit of radius to them, and that's so you can actually walk the iron along the seam as you're pushing the cotton in. They come in a variety of sizes. A lot of times you need all sorts of different ones to get into little places where you can't get in. The nice thing about caulking irons is that they're a very simple shape, so you can actually make your own. If you have to get into, a certain spot, little corner or something like that, you can show this around. That's actually just a bolt that's been heated up on the end and then blacksmithed into a certain shape. And then this is another just smaller one like that was made the same way. That's a caulking iron. This is what's called a dumb iron, and you can see that it's quite a bit thicker than the caulking iron. And this is to actually open up the seams. If you get to a point where you're having a hard time getting your caulking iron in there and the cotton in there, you can open it up a little bit. And most planking material is soft enough that it'll open up, you can caulk it, and then it'll close back up again. As far as what you pound it in with, or the tool that you use, this is an old style caulking iron, kind of. It's not a very good one, but good ones are hard to find. This is what like an old caulker would use usually on a bigger vessel and everything. These are not really meant to punch like this. They're meant to really be able to swing and get larger amounts of cotton into a seam. The shape is specific to the tool. You can see that it's got a couple of slots cut into it too. That does two things. It absorbs a lot of the vibration, because you can imagine that spending 8 hours just kind of beating on something like that, eventually your arm and your hand are going to start screaming. If it's done right, you can get a lot more time out of it. These also create a certain sound, and a lot of times caulkers would use that to determine when they actually had the right amount of pressure in the cotton and when they've driven it in where they wanted it to. It's pretty amazing to listen to a caulker sometimes, because you can almost keep time by them. Once they get into a rhythm, they just keep going and going and going and going. So these will allow you, to spend quite a bit of time. You don't really need one of these to do, a decent amount of caulking. Just a regular mallet will work quite well too. If you do it a lot, you might go through a couple of mallets, but they'll work fine too. The idea with these is that there were a couple of woods. I think it was locust and mesquite, which would actually give you the right kind of tone when you actually, sent the cotton home to the right depth and the right pressure. The wheels here, we use a lot on the bottom planking on the Susan skips. Those are nice straight seams, so you can actually do a lot with one of these wheels and do quite a bit of caulking in a short amount of time. Caulking is kind of fun to do for about the first 5 or 10 minutes. Then it gets pretty repetitive after that. So most people start out with a little tap and an iron on their Susan skips, and after about 3 or 4 seams, they run straight for the wheel. So that's quite a bit faster to do it that way.
Is it both just as effective?
Yeah.
Wheel as it.
Yep. Yeah, either one will work fine. If you've got, I said that we've got nice straight even seams on the bottom of the Susan skips. If you've got seams that have quite a bit of variation, you might have to do a little bit more work with the cotton itself in terms of the amount that you put into the seam. So in that case, the iron will usually work a little bit better because you can control that a little bit easier. But with nice straight seams, that seems to work, quite well that way. So let's try. This cotton will pick up anything. I mean, if you drop this on the ground, when you pick it up, you wouldn't recognize it. It'd just be covered with all sorts of stuff. So you want to try to make sure that you keep it clean. A lot of times, especially when you split, people will actually split a whole bunch of it, then they'll kind of roll it up into a little bit of a ball, and then stick it either, in a little cardboard box or something, just to, help keep it clean and work off of that. Some people work left to right, some people work right to left. I can't remember which way I generally work. This is not a very stiff surface to work, but generally, so the idea behind this, and if this seam was starting to open up or close a little bit and you wanted to put more, you can do what's called gathering, which is just coming back up in here and putting these little guys in, overlapped on each other. You can tell there's a good bit more cotton, in this area right here, just because you kind of gather it and come back over top of itself. I don't know if this is gonna, give it a try. So the idea with this is that as you're coming along with the cotton, you're packing it down. Cedar, or a lot of the materials that we use for planking boats, is really soft material. If you've got really tight seams, and you've got a whole bunch of cotton here, you can actually create a seam up over top of it if you don't stay inside the seam. So as opposed to taking this and knocking it down, picking it up, knocking it down again, picking it up and knocking it down, you keep the back edge of the iron in the seam all the time, and you kind of Pac-Man it in as you're going along. That way your iron can't really jump out of the seam itself and start another seam somewhere else. It's really discouraging when you're pounding away and frame it up inside there and then finally look and realize that you've actually put the cotton, you know, up over top of the seam and missed the seam altogether. This is bouncing way too much. You'll get the idea with this. Eventually it'll go down in there. I don't know. Yeah, you can kind of see it along the sides. Maybe once we're done, you can see it. So the seam only goes, you know, half to 2/3 of the way down. The backside is wood to wood. And what you're trying to do is pack that cotton right at that little joint where that little V stops. You're not trying to drive it, you know, all the way in. So if you're not careful and you start pounding on this too much, you might actually open up that seam instead of just creating a little gasket where you want it back inside there. I don't think that's an uncommon mistake for people to either try to get too much cotton into the seam or totally rely on that cotton to make the thing watertight, which is something you want to try to avoid. And you can usually feel, you know, when you're down there and it feels, you know, pretty tight down up inside there. All right, so let's
It's just
take-
kind of light taps that you're giving it.
Yeah, as opposed to, you know,
Yeah.
trying to beat it. And sometimes, and you'll see probably in that, that went in, you know, pretty easy because we're only using half a strand in a reasonably good sized seam. A lot of times you'll have to go back over it a couple times. You won't get it in, you know, the first time. Let's try the roller. Get the hand on those rollers. Okay, so we're gonna try the roller up inside here. And usually with the roller, I like to twirl it a little bit, and it just helps it go in. So that'll do it pretty quick up inside there if you've got a consistent seam.
How far, this half a strand that we're putting in the Susan skip, there should be like a little, it should be recessed a little bit, right?
Right. Yeah.
How much?
It'll be down there 1/8 of an inch or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
If something goes over top of this.
Yeah, as soon as you're done with your caulking, you want to paint it because that sets it. Otherwise, you know, if a lot of moisture gets into that cotton, you've packed it down, but it'll spring back. But once you've painted over top of it, that pretty well sets it. And then over top of whatever you've painted, you want to put some kind of a glazing compound or seam compound or, you know, something. We use DAP, which is window glazing.
Oh, really?
Yep, and that seems to work pretty well. Some other people, especially in underwater seams, like to use something that's got some anti-fouling in it, so you can get underwater seam compound too to put in the seams.
Kevin, on bigger ships like the schooners here, where they have a good size seam, do they go back and put something? Some kind
Yeah,
of
they
caulk
usually
on that?
caulk several times, you know, with strands, do several ones. And then they put oakum or, you know, something else over top of it. And the oakum's usually been work and it's got some, I don't know if it's pine tar or,
Yeah.
you know, something in it. So they do that over top of it. And that's where, you know, you see the huge beetles that they used to drive it in, and the caulking irons that are held with a handle, because everybody's too scared to, you know, hold it up close while somebody's swinging a big hammer at them. So they really, you know, pack it in there and pounce it in there.
So,
And yeah, that's one thing we had. We had somebody that had worked on schooners, and of course on big boats like that it's all about, you know, forcing it into place. And they started caulking one of our boats and just totally blew out the backside of all the seams because they were just, you know, working it way too hard. to do that, so.
So oakum would be the final product that they put in the seams?
I think so, for the most part. Then they coat the oakum with something, but I'm not sure what.
Oakum is like hemp, right?
It is.
With some kind of tar-like stuff in it.
Yeah.
I think it kind of depends on who's doing it, because I know a few different people who really like just to use straight oakum instead of any cotton at all.
Yeah.
And some people that will just go after cotton, and then they'll put like like 30 or so percent pine tar and a decent dose of red lead and a splash of bottom paint into a bunch of DAP and mix it up, or Jeffrey's Marine or something like that, and you just kind of make your own crazy concoctions to slather over the seams instead of DAP, or whatever kills everything.
Red lead.
And copper.
Yeah, when we paint over it after we've driven the caulking and stuff, we paint over, we're just painting like primer,
Yeah.
just putting it over the seam, not the
Yeah.
whole bottom.
No, not the whole bottom,
Just
just
the seam.
the seam. Yeah, I've actually seen some people, when they wanna do it real quick, just get a can of spray paint primer
Huh.
and put a nozzle on it and just go right along the seam and paint it that way.
I would've, I noticed on mine, when I wedged each board in there when I did it, and all the boards were jointed, but there's some, now I can see like the hairline of blight coming
Right.
through or whatever. So just be careful in that spot, not to drive it all the way through.
Yeah, and generally what you do is you caulk your tighter seams first,
Okay.
and that'll close up,
Oh.
the other ones and kinda even
Okay.
everything up a little bit. Okay.
At the end, when you come to the very bitter end of a plank, do you just kind of cut the cotton off or fold it back or?
Yeah, there's several ways of doing that. I mean, in the Susan skips where we just kinda run off the end,
Mhm.
you've got nothing to kinda butt it up against. We'll actually take it a little bit and then double it back over itself and, pound it back in. If you were running into, like a stem or something like that, a lot of times people will do that, split that, just do a little bit and then run another strand over top of that to kinda lock it all in place.
Should we be cutting our planking flush before we start this process?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there like a heuristic or some sort of rule for the depth of the caulking seam itself? Like when you go to cut the seam, we have it laid out in the Susan Skiff manual, like how to cut that seam, but for something that doesn't have a manual for it.
Halfway.
Yeah, part of it depends on the thickness of the planking.
Right.
I think 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, you'd wanna go halfway or so. Once you start getting above that in thickness, you go about 2/3 of the way.
From 2/3 of the way, like the bottom of the boat is up here, and you're going 2/3 of the way inboard.
The
Yeah.
bevel is 2/3 of the plank.
Wow. Okay.
2/3 would be seam, 1/3 would be wood front bed.
Wow. Okay.
That's what we did on the W.
Yeah, and that can vary, a little bit depending on the builder or what they prefer, but that's generally what that is. All right,
Thanks.
everyone's a caulking expert.